Let's continue looking at some of the successes that Cesar Chavez had. So, like I said earlier, this was definitely an uphill battle, but as the years went by, Cesar Chavez was able to get some tangible benefits for the farm workers. Coachella was one thing, the Great Boycott was one, but there were multiple battles happening up and down the state of California. So, one of the gains, like just an overall type of picture, was farm workers did get about 70% increase in wages, which is quite significant because most of them were below the poverty level. Another thing that the union was able to strike a deal with was healthcare. Understand that many of these workers, when they work out in the field, it's back-breaking work, particularly on your body. So sometimes they used to spray pesticides, and the farm workers would consume that as they're picking these fruits and vegetables. So healthcare was very important. Disability insurance was another benefit, something that um, because of the type of work that they do, many of them have to go on disability. So that was another kind of benefit that he was able to get them. A pension plan for retirement plan. Most of these people never saved, right? Because the money isn't quite there to put into a portfolio or anything like that. So taking money and putting that in a pension plan for the farm workers was a major benefit for retirement. Other things that were that helped the farm workers, such as uh, eliminating the short hoe. So normally when they pick some of these vegetables that were on the ground, they would be bent over the entire time. And if anybody who's done this kind of labor, you know that this takes a toll on the body. So they got a long hoe instead of a short hoe, and that allowed them to stand up as they're bringing up some of this vegetation. So that was very beneficial for the farm workers. Many of them had back problems before the introduction of this tool. Trying to eliminate pesticides was very important, as I said earlier. As these people are working the fields, they're consuming some of these pesticides. There are statements by some of these farm workers saying that they used to spray the fields while they were out there working, and some of these pesticides cause cancer. So Cesar Chavez was able to, again, push the elimination of using these pesticides, but also what made him so smart is that he used public media to show the consumers that they were consuming these pesticides, right? Because yes, the workers are dealing with this, but we're the ones that are actually putting these vegetables and fruits into our bodies. So through this kind of publicity campaign, he was able to have some farms eliminate pesticides. And he pushed for the elimination of any future worker program, such as the Bracero program. As I stated earlier, the Bracero program exploited many of the workers that came from Mexico. Many of them left the program. They just walked away, and it's better for them to be undocumented than be part of that program because they didn't pay much money. They were actually stealing money from many of them, and they were living in horrible working conditions. So Cesar Chavez pushed for that type of program to never be brought up again. I think the last time they thought about bringing it back was when George Bush II was in office about 20 years ago. So again, those are some of the gains. Cesar Chavez was a very religious man, and he used religion to his advantage. Normally I have some videos that I'm not going to play for you, but there's a great documentary that talks about Cesar Chavez and the whole farm workers movement. Cesar Chavez was Catholic, just like many Mexican and Mexican American workers who tend to be Catholic because of our culture and our faith, is so directly linked to Catholicism. But for this particular battle out in the fields, it was quite problematic because the church always took a neutral stand. The Catholic Church took a neutral stand because many of them were being supported by the farm growers. So they didn't want to antagonize them. But at the same time, the whole purpose of the church is to support the poor. So this made them look really bad by not taking a position. And again, because they're economically tied to the farm growers, they needed that cash flow. However, there were other groups, such as Protestants. They tended to help Cesar Chavez's movement during this time. So some Mexican and Mexican Americans converted because they were the ones out there actually doing something. Not the Catholic Church, but the Protestant Church. some of these different branches of Protestantism. Cesar Chavez, though, throughout his movement, used religion to his advantage. He always preached nonviolence. He used different parts of our faith in this movement, and part of it had to do, again, he's a great person at using the different media forms. Part of it had to do because, if you remember, I mentioned earlier that many of these movements were labeled communist, and by attaching the church to his movement, at least his faith to his movement, it didn't make it seem communist anymore. It made it seem almost like a religious revival, which is very much so part of American culture. So he used a lot of dichos, such as, turn the other cheek when there was violence out in the fields, and there's great video footage that shows some of these sheriff people coming into the fields and just beating the heck out of the farm workers when they were on strike, which is a constitutional right that they had to protest. And Cesar Chavez, turn the other cheek, don't fight back, basically, right? Using some of this knowledge from the church to support his movement. So yeah, nonviolence became an important tool. MLK was doing it. Obviously, both of them are influenced by Gandhi, that had a major impact in India. But much of his religion actually came from his mom too. His mother really influenced his personal faith. And another important movement to Cesar Chavez's UFW movement was this movement called Theology of Liberation. Let me quickly explain this. In Latin America, there was a push by a few kind of religious figures that was advocating for the Catholic Church to go back to its foundation of helping the poor. If you know anything about the Catholic Church, it's super wealthy, it has a lot of money. It's a very kind of top-down institution. Well, in places like Chile, Argentina, they were pushing to going back to this fundamental message of Jesus, right? Of helping the weak, the poor, those who are distraught. So this kind of influenced much of the movement over here in the United States, because the farm workers were the poor, right? They're the ones who needed the help. So he was able to implement this kind of theological movement that was Catholic, and use it for his movement that advocated of going for the Catholic Church to go back to its fundamental roots, right? Jesus wasn't about helping the rich, he was about helping the poor. So this movement really kind of struck a chord with many Catholics that the church should focus on those people again. And then other things that he did with the church was focus on certain symbols that people recognize, particularly many of the farm workers. La Virgen de Guadalupe was used, you see it here, as the virgin saint of this movement. Again, to kind of block them from that accusation of them being communist. So a lot of symbols, a lot of music was used in this movement. He also used a pilgrimage. They actually, and this is what you see here, is part of a pilgrimage. But in the 1960s, he did a pilgrimage from Delano in California all the way to Sacramento. And he did it so he could arrive to Sacramento on Easter. It didn't quite work out that way. But nevertheless, again, he's taking all these religious elements and appropriating them to his movement that is no longer almost a farm workers movement, a labor movement, but rather a religious movement to some extent, though it's still very much so a labor movement. Now, Cesar Chavez was very influential to the Chicano movement. He held many rallies at universities. He would go up to different campuses, give a talk, tell students, particularly white students, but there were a few Latinos there, that they should give up their lunch money so he can help this cause, and he would, some of the white students would help them. But that's where he kind of, a lot of Chicanos who are, there were far and few between at the universities, were able to join some of these movements. So a lot of the terminology that you saw in the video from this previous lesson and the one that you'll see in this next section but the student walkout comes from the Chicano, or sorry, from the UFW. Remember, the UFW is a labor movement. It's for workers. It just happens to be them. The majority of people are Latino or Mexican Americans. However, terms like Viva la Causa or Viva la Raza became part of the lexicon of the Chicano movement, even though this term was focused on the UFW movement. Other things that emerged were the UFW flag. This is supposed to represent the Mexican flag, but it's done in a way that anybody can draw it. And another interesting aspect of the UFW, again, it's a farm workers movement, is Teatro Campesino. Many of the people who helped Cesar Chavez were college students. I mean, they were young Chicanos who were in college and wanted to create this social change and help the farm workers, partly because their parents were also farm workers. So there's a lot of creativity happening in the UFW, so much so that they developed their own artistic style of developing plays while they were out there protesting. You're on the field, you're protesting, you're in the picket sign, you come up with music, but they also came up with an artistic style. And by this I mean more like a play. They would do these these short skits addressing some of the things that they were going through, and that way other people can learn of the conditions that the farm workers went through a play. And eventually it got so big that it branched out and became its own kind of theater group, and they did plays like at Broadway in New York, and Luis Valdez, who kind of organized Teatro Campesino, eventually becomes a Hollywood director. So he did the movie Zoot Suit and a few other films too, but that was the first one, Zoot Suit. So Cesar Chavez's movement is very important, and I want to really kind of hit this point again. I already touched on it a few times, but this is really, the UFW was really a farm workers movement. Like I said earlier, it just happened to have mostly Latinos, Mexican Americans, so that's why it gets connected with the Chicano movement. But Cesar Chavez was about helping the working class through this movement. Cesar Chavez, like the last slide indicated, he's not alone in this, but he definitely helps give some sense of birth to the Chicano movement. So I know I addressed him a little bit late compared to the video that you watched in the previous lesson, but Cesar Chavez, many of these organizers get their start in this particular movement. And that kind of, they're college students or young students, and then they start off some of their other movements elsewhere. And then the last point here is that, I think it's the last point. Yeah, it is. The last point is the civil rights movement is rooted in moral philosophy. Cesar Chavez was not trying to make farm workers rich. He was just trying to give them a sense of dignity for what they do and what they contribute to this nation. So it's definitely rooted in this moral philosophy, if not even Christianity. And that's part of the reason why he used religious symbolism so much in this movement. All right, so I'll stop it there. And the next lesson, the next thing you have to do is watch the documentary about young students such as yourselves creating change in the educational system. So you'll watch a documentary with a few questions that you have to answer.